Welcome. Thank you everybody for having joined this webinar of EHEC 20. So it's ehealthecon.org, and we are meeting today to talk about cellular device location data, a fairly new resource to many researchers, which is proving especially valuable during this public health crisis. So I'm Lee Simon. I'm going to be moderating this webinar. This started as a conversation that a group of us, Martin Anderson, Shushan Danagulian, David Susky, and I had about how it would be useful to have a meeting like this where we could develop our collective knowledge and also make it easier for newcomers in this area of research to enter and do more research. So we are incredibly grateful to the individuals and companies that have made this access to researchers possible, and thank them for their efforts. So we are joined by Ross Epstein, Chief of Staff at SafeGraph, Victor Couture, who's an assistant professor at UC Berkeley, who along with his team has made it possible for researchers to access PlaceIQ data, and Kate Myers, Vice President of Product at Uber Media. At the end of this call, actually, I think in the chat window, we will be sharing a Google Doc that summarizes some of the main frequently asked questions you might have about some of these data. And we're also going to put into the chat window some news articles that might give a good introduction if this is one of the first times you might be encountering these data. And so we can get into covering the basics of what are the ways that these data are collected, what is it, how we are able to get access as researchers. And so we'll be asking the participants in the order of that we have in the poster to tell us a bit about these. And after that, we'll get into Q&A. So before we do that, just a few rules of the game. And you'll see in the chat window, there is space for entering in your questions. So please send us your questions in that way. And you'll also be able to see this Google sheet, and we'll make sure that we get those questions in. So we're gonna start by now turning it over to our first speaker, Ross from SafeGraph. Ross?
Hey everybody, good to meet you all. Handful of familiar faces and names. By way of introduction, my name is Ross Epstein. I'm the Chief of Staff of a company called SafeGraph. A little bit of background on me. I studied computer science in school, ended up starting an enterprise SaaS company. I was the CEO of that. We sold that to LinkedIn in December of 2018, spent some time at LinkedIn, and then joined in with the SafeGraph organization earlier this year, so very excited. SafeGraph is a geospatial data company. That is all we do. So to be even more concrete, our products are just very expensive CSV files. That's it, that's all we sell. And we don't do analysis. We don't build products on top of these data sets. It's purely data. Our tagline is that we do our best to predict the past, and hopefully to equip folks and researchers such as yourselves to predict the future, given the data sets that we derive out of past occurrences. So I'll give you a little bit of background on the products we make, and then a little bit about the academic support that we've been doing historically. So SafeGraph provides really 3 core data sets, generally commercially. First is what we call our core places data set. So a list of all places in the United States where consumers can spend money or can spend time. And that's filled out by NAICS codes and geocoded to lat long and all the other attributes that you might need on a place. Then we understand the building geometries of those points of interest and of those places. And given those two data sets, we then combine that with a panel of tens of millions of mobile devices to determine what our third product is called patterns, which is using visit attribution. We determine on a broken and aggregated on an hour by hour and day by day basis, what are the number of visitors that you're seeing to a specific point of interest. What are the origin census block groups that they're coming from? What are the related same day brands that they might be going to? So if they're going to Walmart, are they also going to Starbucks or et cetera, et cetera? And a bunch of really interesting patterns about those points of interest. We have, and then COVID came about in March, and we spun up another product called social distancing metrics, which keys to a census block group. So within the device, within the census block groups and the devices that we determine that are at-home residences over like a 6-week rolling period that we determine to live within those census blocks. What do we see as the aggregated what do we see as the aggregated data about things like median distance traveled, what are the devices that are staying home all day, if they are leaving, how long are they leaving, et cetera, et cetera. And that's called our social distancing metrics. So we've historically always had like a much more under wraps academic program. So on the much smaller, our motto again is, one of our mottos, I already said the predict the past one, but another one being open access to information. So open information to power innovation. And so academic programs very fit very well within this. And so we've had this very smaller, much smaller academic program where researchers who are looking to do different types of research can come in and use SafeGraph data at no cost and get access to our data sets. With COVID, we got of course probably 100x number of requests. Actually, yeah, 100x number of requests, as well as from the public sector. So we sort of pivoted our very small academic program into what we call now the SafeGraph COVID-19 Data Consortium, where we are providing no-cost access to all of our data sets for non-commercial use and for effectively anybody who can help. Right. So academics and academic research is excellent, and we love that use case. We have quite a few, a good number of states, a large number of cities, quite a few in the federal sector. So all layers of the public sector who are diving in and are utilizing our data to be able to do a bunch of different types of research across anything you could possibly think of. So I think I've been talking long enough, but that's the high level intro of SafeGraph and myself.
Thank you very much. So as a reminder, we please encourage you to put in questions you have throughout the presentations, and we'll take them at the Q&A window. So next, I'd like to ask Victor Couture from UC Berkeley to discuss some of the data that he and his team have been distributing, which come from PlaceIQ. Victor?
Yes, I will share some slides if that's okay. Here. Can everyone see that? Am I able to make this? Okay, excellent. Let me here. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak. This collaboration is joint work with my academic colleagues, so Jonathan Dingle from Chicago, Alison Green from Princeton, Jesse Henbury from Penn, and Kevin Williams from Yale, and also the people at PlaceIQ that have helped us. So Drew Brownick, Nicholas Shilas, Stephanie Smiley, and Elizabeth Cutroni. So first, I'd like to tell you briefly about who we are and why we're doing this. And then I'll try to the rest of the slides to answer the questions as best as I can. So like Kozali and like Ross, like early on the pandemic, we realized like the usefulness of tracking human activity in real time using smartphone data. And we've been doing academic research with the PlacelQ data for a few years. So it made sense for us to take over the release of data for academic and policy users. And then PlacelQ still conducts its own research and releases its own data for commercial users, mostly targeted at business owners and marketers that want to know their customers better to make business decisions or to advertise in a more targeted way. So what we are doing is publishing every day these two indices, the Location Exposure Index that captures county-to-county movement, and the Device Exposure Index that captures social contact within commercial venues. We designed both indices to be used for COVID research, keeping the COVID in mind. So I'll describe them in a bit more detail later. If I have time, please stop me after 10 minutes. I'm fairly sure I'm going to go over. I know I shouldn't, but so please stop me. I know everyone's busy. And soon we'll be releasing a companion paper that those interested can read to learn more generally about the suitability of smartphone data for quantifying movement and social contact, like the caveats and the high research potential of that data. Our objective in releasing these indices, so we're hoping to lower entry costs for new research, to make it easier to compare different research studies using our data by providing a transparent methodology of how we build our index and a detailed description of the data source. We also hope that all of these indices have been approved by IRB for release, so it's going to be a bit easier like that with human subject to go through the publication process. And more generally, we're one of many data sources. SafeGraph is another great one, so we're just happy to be part of this broader movement to make data available to researchers in real time, which is pretty amazing, and that I hope will last when the pandemic is over. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the data itself. So I'll describe how PlaceIQ takes the movement data and transforms it into visits. So devices, smartphones produce GPS pings whenever an app requests location data. PlaceIQ buys these location pings from smartphone app provider, and the set of application is not revealed to us. That's a business secret of PlaceIQ, but all of these apps are carefully vetted by them. That's the key product for representativeness, for quality, and for privacy compliance. There's some applications that will collect data only when you use them. Some other applications will collect data at regular interval. But if you shut off the location capacity of an application, it will stop recording your location. So you can do that for privacy reasons, for instance. How are visits created? There's a base map of polygons that represent venue. So say there could be a polygon that's a big polygon that represents a Walmart. And whenever a device intersects the polygon, you call that a visit. And then visits are cleaned based on a number of density of pings in or near venue, the source of ping data, and the size of the venue. So if you ping inside a Walmart, it's a huge venue with only a parking lot outside. We know that visit with fairly high precision. The device covered, so smartphone samples vary through time, right? The typical device remains about 6 months in a sample. When you update your OS, when you change your app use, there's many reasons why a device can drop out of the sample. There's lots of heterogeneity, so many devices are only there for a day or two. Even devices that stay a long time don't ping regularly. So for our application, we wanted to select devices whose movement could be characterized over time. So we only kept devices that ping for 11 days out of 14 over any time period over any 14-day period since November 2019. When we needed to assign demographics, we did it based on the Census Blockgroup a device lived in. PlaceIQ has information about building characteristics, but we're not using them yet. We're using Census Blockgroup. And as that was one of the questions mentioned, there was a large drop in devices generating pings starting March 2020. and the number of devices active on a daily basis in a sample had a large drop. By far, the most likely explanation for this is that these devices are sheltering in place. If you stay at home, you stop moving, the GPS in your phone will stop recording your location, you will stop pinging. So this is perfectly in line with how this technology work. And we created some adjustment of our indices to account for that, assuming that the entire drop in devices is due to devices that make no visits to commercial venues and that stay at home. So and otherwise, all of the patterns that we see during the pandemic are completely sensible, and we show them in the paper, but I won't show them today. Then the last thing I hope to talk about, and again, Kozali stop me when I'm out of time, is about sample representativeness, which is another question we were asked. Smartphone data cover a significant fraction of US population. 80% of adults have a smartphone, so there's potential to be very representative there. About 10% of the adult population is in our clean device sample, but there's many reasons why the sample could end up being unrepresentative. It's not because your data is large that it's representative. There's bias in smartphone ownership. Only 53% of 65-year and older own a smartphone. So older people much less likely to own a smartphone. So smartphone samples unlikely to be representative along an age dimension. There's bias in app use and privacy settings that are possible. For your own research application, you may select a sample that becomes unrepresentative. And if you look at smaller geographic units, you'll get more bias and more noise. So I'll show you 4 plots to gauge the representativeness of the data. So here is just census population on number of devices in the data at the state and county level. So you can see more populous states have more devices, more populous counties have more devices. The R-square is really high. So that's basic data check passed by the data. Here we're looking at whether the distribution of devices, the spatial distribution of devices within a county is representative. I'll use population density as an example because that's the only place where we see something a bit less representative. So here, what this tells us is that there's 7% of devices that live in the highest density decile of population. If devices were spatially perfectly evenly distributed, there would be 10% of devices living in the top decile. Along every other dimension, household income, share white, share college educated, we find about 10% of devices in each of the decile of the block group distribution within county. So the data is fairly representative on that front. Caveat here is that if we use national decile instead of within counties, then we see a bit more bias towards white and rural area where we see more devices there. So given our specific sample selection and application, we'd recommend using either within counties application or cross county work, but in percentage change, given what we see about representativeness. This is another data check looking at long-term movement. On the x-axis, this is what we know from the Internal Revenue Service about migration, people who changed their address over the last year out of state. This is from the PlacelQ data, people that had another permanent location over the last year. And we see that's an R-square of about 0.8, a bit under the 45-degree line, but overall very good fit. This is at the state level. If we do it at the county level, we get an R-square of about 0.14. When we select larger counties, the R-square rises. So that's one example here of a computation that requires a large unit. So the question of how small a unit is delivers enough precision really depends on the application. If you want to precisely measure city-to-city movement, permanent movement, which is really interesting to do post-pandemic, or people moving permanently out, then you'll have to select cities or states at the zip code or small county level. The data is not going to be precise enough. So it's really application specific. And here, to briefly summarize this, we compared, this is for short-term movement representativeness, we compared trip length in the National Household Survey with trip length to commercial venues in the PlacelQ data. And we find the distributions of trip length are remarkably similar, and both data sets show that higher density areas have shorter trips. And here, I think this is my last slide. So briefly define the indices that we're making publicly available. So the location exposure index measures cross-county movement. So it's a location-to-location matrix that tells you the share of device that pinged in a county B that also pinged in a county A during the last 14 days. So for instance, if you're in Suffolk County, a bit outside of New York City, it tells you what's the share of devices that have pinged in Manhattan over the last 14 days and that are in your county. So there was this famous paper in Science showing like how the virus spread out of Wuhan, China. We chose a 14-day look back based on the incubation, what we know about the incubation period of COVID. So we think it could be relevant to the long-term movement that could be spreading the virus. The device exposure index is about like short-term like contact movement. So it measures social contact within commercial venues. We chose these venues to be indoor and to be presumably small enough so exposure is meaningful. And we measure the average exposure of devices to other devices within commercial venues. So say if a Walmart receives 100 visitors and I visit that Walmart today, then my exposure is 100 over that day. So those are the two indices that we make available. We show a lot of examples of application and we show they deliver like reasonable patterns during the pandemic, but our hope is really that other researchers pick them up and do some deeper investigation. We make them public for other research. So in conclusion, the smartphone data captures movement and social contact in real time. So it's a really useful data source now and in the future. It's broadly representative, but with some caveats. So we really encourage researchers to do some data checks and make sure that it is representative given their empirical application. And here's the GitHub the repository where we update these indices every day. So thank you very much. I don't know if I went over, I imagine I did, but I thought.
Thank you very much, Victor. And I have to ask, we will have questions on this soon. Are you willing to share these slides?
Of course.
Great. We can figure out a way to have it on the ehealthecon.org website or some other way, but thank you. And just as a reminder, please keep those questions coming in on the chat window. We're collecting them and we'll get to ask those of the panelists soon. But now we're going to turn over to Kate Myers from Uber Media, who's going to discuss their data next.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm the Vice President of Product at Uber Media. And I think it's really great to have a session like this because mobile location data is an extremely powerful data set. I think it's really unlike anything else that we've seen, and it's really come into its own in the last few years. In 2011, I think about 30% of people owned a smartphone, and as Victor showed in one of his slides, today that number is much higher. And so on the whole, mobile location data is really representative of populations and what they're doing. A little background on Uber Media, we actually started as an app publisher and in the advertising business. And it's very interesting because advertising often drives innovation. And I think it did in this space. We started using mobile location data, as PlaceIQ did as well, to help brands measure the effectiveness of advertising and driving people to locations. And that was really a jumping off point for those of us who work in the mobile location data space to recognize the broader impact that mobile location data can have in a variety of sectors. And most recently, and I think perhaps the most exciting thing I've worked on in my career is what's been going on in the last few months with the challenges that the pandemic has given all of us and how mobile location data can be used in this venue to do things that are really powerful and life-saving. So I think just a few things I can add. One of the things at Uber Media that we really focus on is being transparent and spending time educating people on mobile location data. It's not quite as simple as buying an iPad and opening it up and you're off to the races. There are a number of providers out there. There's overlap in the different providers. And as Victor had pointed out, there are things that you need to understand about the observability of devices. Mobile location data providers don't see every device all the time. There are considerations about bias that you need to look at. And also it's a huge data set. So another thing that we really work with our partners on is figuring out what your use case is, what capabilities you have, how quickly you need to do something. Are you capable and interested in working in underlying data where you can develop metrics and evaluate kind of the statistical significance, or are you looking for something that's a little more derivative that can get you perhaps to some insights more quickly in aggregated form? And so our approach has been a little bit different from SafeGraph in this perspective, that we really provide tiers of solutions. We have solutions where we can provide underlying data. We have solutions where we have derivative metrics that are still really huge data sets, but cut a little closer to the insights that people are trying to get to. And then we also do have solutions that really are visual. The geospatial work has been done and presented, and it really drives at a specific use case. Where we found, after we started working with brands measuring the effectiveness of advertising, we found that an industry that was really ready to start using mobile location data was the commercial real estate space. And I think a lot of mobile location data has been used in that space. And the advantage of that is we've worked through a lot of the questions around mobile location data, so that when we got to this point, sort of with the global pandemic, a lot of techniques have been developed that are useful in terms of understanding the data, working with it, deriving data sets from it. In the last few months, what we've focused on, we have a platform that generally lets researchers query our data. So you can define a time frame and you can define a space, and we have a few structured data formats that we can return back to you, including the devices we saw in that space, and also information about how devices are pathing in and out of that space, and what we call a common evening and common daytime location, which are proxies for home and work. That research tool is there, and a number of our partners and researchers are using that. We also realize that things are moving extremely quickly right now, and there are a couple key questions that researchers are looking at, and those are around social distancing, engagement in the community, how much are people traveling out and about, and then engagement with retail and different types of retail. So how much are we seeing devices go out to essential retailers, non-essential retailers, grocery, pharmacy, et cetera. And I think Ross talked a little bit about how that works. There's not too much difference in the way that we do that. We define these retail locations and we place devices inside of those, and you can do comparative studies and studies over time. It's been so interesting to see what this has meant in the last few months, because just even within the US, both policy and behaviors have been significantly different, even county by county. And so as organizations, whether these are academic organizations who are perhaps working with local, state or even national government, or industry, so retailers, et cetera, try to understand how to safely open, it's incredibly difficult to get a sense of what's going on nationally. And it's really not the same. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach that's going to work. And so I think that's where mobile location data can be really powerful. Victor showed some really great slides there. You have to kind of figure out what your study is and what the right aggregation is, but the long story short with mobile location data is that you can do quite granular studies, maybe even on a census tract or census block group level, that give you an indication of how populations are responding to policy, how their behavior set is changing, and that in turn can be used to predict revenue, whether that's tax revenue or retail revenue. It can be used to measure the effectiveness of policy and messaging. We also have been working with, we are a California-based company, so a bit more with the government here in California and organizations here to do more micro studies on the impact on populations like the homeless population. Are we seeing different patterns of movement there, and can that inform services that are provided, whether that's nonprofit organizations, government organizations, or in the healthcare space? So the number of and types of studies that can be done in this current climate are really varied. And again, that goes back to why we have different tiers of solutions. But what we are providing is 34 recovery-focused metrics that can be run against a specific set of points. So those could be retail locations, really any physical locations that you can define. And we're also providing those 34 metrics against just geospatial statistical areas. So Census, Blockgroup, tract, county, state, or the US, and you can look at those metrics over time and you can compare different geographies and see what's happening. So geographic and time-based comparisons. And then we do also offer this query-based tool when people are interested in doing ad hoc studies. That the thing I talked about with homelessness would be an example of a very specific study that the query tool is useful for. That's really the background on Uber Media and where we've been focused the last few months.
Thanks very much, Kate, and thanks, Victor and Ross. This is such a valuable set of information you're letting us have this look into. And thank you to the participants who've been sending in questions. So we're going to now take some of those questions and feel free also to just look as you see things on the list as it's scrolling to make these take on any of these questions. But just some things I've been noting here. For example, a question on how it's known what the home location is. Is there differences in how that is determined across the data sources? That's one question. I might maybe start with that and see who might want to jump in on that.
I can take it. So in our case, what we do is we design our own algorithm to assign a home location. So basically, it's where you spend the most time at night. So every week, we look at the place where you spend the most time at night, if you stay at least 3 nights. And then we're going to call that your home if for a stretch of 4 weeks, you spend the most time at night in that same residential location. We'll call that your home. There could be other ways to do it, but small perturbations of the algorithm deliver like really similar home assignments. So that's how we do it.
Yeah, that's relatively similar to our size. We take a geohash 7 granularity, so like about 150 meters, 150 by 150-ish for nighttime location. But ours is, I think we do it over a 6-week rolling period from our side. But yeah, same thing.
Our methodology is very similar as well.
That's great to know. There's a question about whether something like if you're going to be thinking about these as visits to locations, if it's something like curbside pickup, would you be then counted as visiting? And then on the other side, a question that asked, what if you're in a place that's indoors that there may not be good reception on, maybe not windows as many or so, will that visit be missed? So I get a question of things we don't traditionally think of as a visit because it's a curbside, just passing through the parking lot, versus visits that might be not, are there visits that cell signals don't record?
I can start answering some of that. Yes, the long story short with mobile location data, there are certainly visits to locations that are not observed. We've been doing this day in, day out for a long time. It's a very small set of locations that are truly problematic because of the physical space, and something to be aware of. The accuracy of mobile location data is really dependent on hardware. There's a few key considerations there. There's commercial satellite technology and accuracy. There's the receivers on the phone itself. And then there's actually software that's beginning to improve the accuracy of GPS, in that Android and iOS now look at other hardware, including Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, and use that as secondary triangulation to make GPS more accurate. what we've seen in the last 5 years is an incredible improvement in the accuracy of GPS because of this, and in the observability of devices. I think anybody who was in Manhattan 10 years ago and tried to use their GPS knew that it would often not have any clue where you are. It would be bouncing around, and that has improved significantly. This becomes a really nuanced question, and you can get deep in the weeds, and we're very happy to do that, especially with researchers who it's very important they get it right. But I think the short way we answer this question is, do you trust your device when you're driving at 70 miles an hour and getting off an exit? Do you trust the accuracy? And how often is that, how quickly is that getting better, and how often is the problem, as kind of a basic way to understand the accuracy. And even in situations where a device may not have cellular connectivity, most of the SDKs out on the market now will capture the GPS and will wait until there is a connection again, and then we'll send up the signal. So yes, there are areas where mobile location data is challenged, but they are increasingly few and far between. I don't know if Ross and Victor would agree with that, with what they see.
This was a great answer, and it's something that she's much better able to answer than me, being on the side of the data provider.
Yeah, to answer the curbs, great answer on granularity, and to also answer on the curbside pickup. I think In and I, we try to determine an in-polygon visit as often as possible. So in an ideal scenario, those curbsides do not pick up. But as Kate mentioned, mobile location data is very challenging. I posted a link in the chat if you guys are interested. We have a technical white paper about how we do visit attribution that you guys are free to download. It's like 40 pages or something like that. If you guys are interested in getting a real deep dive, we built that so that folks could do their, given our geometry products, and if they had their own first party panel, then they could do their own visit attribution. So we built this for.
Great, thank you. There's information you had in your slides, Victor, about the demographic characteristics that are known about who has and hasn't cell phone usage, for example. So that gets at one of the questions that's asked, which is about representativeness, or what is your sense of how to think about this? It is, 10% of the US population in some cases, greater, but aside from age, is there anything more you'd like to share about representativeness or bias in the data?
I mean, broadly speaking, we shared what we knew and what is doable, right? Because fundamentally, you do not know the exact characteristics of these devices. Like, another way to proceed would be like, if you have the raw data, the individual level data, you know a lot about their activity. So based on their activity, you could infer something even about their gender if you wanted. If you have some good information about the differential visits that men and women make, you could, in theory, do this. But in our case, not like pinning down an individual like that, assigning census level characteristics, the best we can do is pretty much what we've shown. And I'm seeing a question about gender. Again, it could be done at the individual level if you have a good prior on the kind of visits that men and women make. But if you use the census demographic information, you won't be able to infer much about gender because it's fairly evenly distributed across block groups. The reason we know if we have more, say, white, a device that are ethnicity white or Hispanic or Black or Asian is because there's some block groups that are overwhelmingly white or overwhelmingly Black. And if we see more device in those, we suspect that the sample may be biased. So I don't know if that answers the question, but
No,
it's a tricky area. And
yeah,
I think
no.
we're probably glad to know that we do not know the identity or the characteristics of these devices.
Right, it's the trade-off with the
It's a good
unknown.
thing to know if you have a smartphone.
Ross, is there any comment you had on?
Yeah, I was gonna maybe quickly share my screen. Let me share this. So we have this is all of our docs are public. If you guys are interested in diving in, I think this is a lot of the best resources. If anybody has any great questions, but we have, for example, like a Google notebook where we do talk about bias in the SafeGraph data set and how you may measure and correct for any sampling bias. So you can dive in and take a look at our analysis, or go into the collab notebook and dive right in and see what we've got as well. So feel free if you guys are interested. It's just a notebook.
Great, thank you. There's a question or a couple of questions that have touched on international location data. Is it only US, or are all of your data sources worldwide?
We're international. There are a few countries, to pick a few extreme examples, North Korea and China, that are challenging for mobile location data, but generally North America, Central South America, most of Europe, and the better part of Asia, we have mobile location coverage.
Can I ask, sorry, about developing countries? Like, because it's so important to know more about movement in developing countries right now. Like, how many of these do you have, like, in the poorer part of the world?
It depends, and really, you know, we actually do a breakdown of country by country. If anybody's interested in a particular country, that we can give very specific numbers on what coverage we have. But it really depends. I think one of the important questions to ask if you're looking at international, and actually in the US, is mobile location data sources that are carrier agnostic, because there's a couple primary ways to source mobile location data. You can actually get it from the carriers if they're willing to provide it. But carriers are, we were talking about bias, carriers are going to be very likely to be biased because carriers tend to be higher end or lower end or aligned with certain devices, versus getting mobile location data from the app ecosystem, so that there's hundreds of thousands of apps out there and many of them use SDK technology with location collection. That is generally a better way to source data anywhere in the world, really, because it's going to span socioeconomic backgrounds and it's going to align with the overall population. So, and smartphone adoption. So it's going to depend on the smartphone adoption in a country, but if the smartphone adoption in a country is sufficient, those users will be visible in the mobile location ecosystem due to the fact that they will be using apps. And I think, I can't remember, I think the latest stat I saw is that the average smartphone user, I believe this is internationally, has 80 apps on their phone. So if people in a country are using smartphones, they're using apps, they're going to be visible.
There's a question that I think this might have been part of what you touched on, Kate, in thinking about the reliability of GPS systems, but a specific one, perhaps this might be helpful as an example. If you are in a multi-storied building and there's residential and there's, let's say, a healthcare provider or some other retail venue in there, how confident are we that as of now, GPS signals can pinpoint whether you're on floor 1 or floor 2, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question. Verticality is one area where the industry is not mature yet. So the devices physically can collect that data, but the ecosystem surrounding devices where that data is collected and sent is not strong. So that is one area where it can be challenging. The thing you have to do is take it on a case-by-case basis. So we have done, for example, studies where we correlate foot traffic to sales for a particular brand. And that's a great way to determine, if you have a retailer in a mixed-use building, do the sales in that location correlate? If so, you're probably predominantly seeing that location and it's not being impacted too much by if there was residential above it, for example. But this is one of the areas where mobile location data is imperfect right now. I suspect if we ask this question again in 2 to 3 years, it will be different. But right now, that's an area where you have to evaluate what's going on.
Thank you. And just as a reminder, please keep sending in any other questions into the chat window. And I'm checking with Shushan and David and Martin whether I've missed any right now. But if you have sent one and I haven't asked, please retype that in. There's questions we've had about what are particular research questions that your organizations might be focused on. I think we heard a little bit about it might be very highly used in real estate, but is there any particular area that you think these data are, other than right now in the pandemic, particularly useful for, or that you have as interests? I think what I'm trying to ask is, are there areas that as organizations you'd like to see more research in, or anything you might have to convey to researchers of where you think there's potential for things that would be valuable to know more about? And likewise, are there some areas that you would not want these data used for?
Well, I can speak, I'll speak to the negative case. We have a very strong stance that mobile location data should not be used for law enforcement. It should not be used for any kind of surveillance. And we take that very seriously. So I would say anything in that bucket. Also, evaluating whether there's anything to do with health insurance coverage in the US is another area we feel very strongly the data should not be used. In terms of where it should be used, I think anything that relies on people traveling through physical space could probably benefit from mobile location data studies. An area we're increasingly putting focus is kind of what you could broadly lump as urban analytics. It doesn't necessarily mean it's urban, but it's sort of like commuter patterns, changes in housing and general human movement. I think Victor brought up the use case of people potentially moving out of areas or temporarily moving. So that's something that we're very interested in. I did mention that tourism, of course, right now there is not very much tourism going on, but when we emerge from the pandemic, that's a really interesting area to understand what type of people tourism destinations are drawing from. Operational decisions for organizations. One kind of, there's just a million small use cases. Waste management and other companies like that are trying to determine where population growth is happening the fastest so they can invest in land and infrastructure. The census is not run very frequently. Mobile location data is a much more up-to-speed metric on population shifts. So anything where you're trying to anticipate growth in population is a valid study.
Yeah, and I've been spending a disproportionate amount of my time on COVID-based work, and so I've had a very interesting. I've really enjoyed a lot of the policy and response work that has come from the types of research that we've been seeing. So we worked very closely with the California Governor's Office and them doing very cool things like determining POI hotspots on a grocery store basis to understand that are we seeing too much, or are we seeing visits, too many visits in a specific hour, and do we need to implement like a pop-up grocery store type of stuff, right? And so these have been very, very, very interesting to be watching. Of course, the just broad set urban mobility is great as well, and how folks have changed. But I mean, this kind of teeters between non-commercial and commercial, but like cities estimating tax revenues, right? And how do they think about what the economic impact is going to be over the coming over their coming year, and how much they should expect their deficit to look like. So a lot of economic policy work that's been happening as well, and we're in most of the Federal Reserve banks and all these types of folks, and we've been seeing a lot of great economic policy work as well. So and of course the epidemiological and all that kind of stuff, but. And then on our commercial side, of course, the insurance use cases, the financial services use cases, all those types of things that you guys would generally understand, that would be that this would benefit as well.
Yeah, one other thing on the disease piece that has been really, I think, fascinating and powerful is determining populations that are at higher risk due to social distancing. So we've developed a metric in our data where we look at how often devices are coming within 5 meters, within 5 minutes of another device. And that can be run broadly geospatially. So you can look at census blocks or census tracts or county, whatever level you want to aggregate, to look at comparatively, is this county or census tract social distancing less than maybe some others? And is that changing, which direction is that changing over time? You can overlay policy decisions on that and see the impact. You can even do that type of study on things like warehouses and businesses to assess what kind of risk are you putting your staff or customers, depending on what type of organization is, university campuses and other things like that, and to really quantify social distancing in different geographies.
That's a great answer to that question. And I think one of the last questions that came in, you have addressed through this, which is, it seems like there are settings where researchers will have questions that have to do with getting at or using the data in different ways than the products you currently have. For example, if we want to see what fraction of people who went to one location then go to the next location, are there, and that just that as one example, are there opportunities if researchers have for partnering with on creating different products? Are there avenues for that? And then maybe as part of this, so I think we're close to time and to the last questions, are there ways you have as recommended of how to get in contact with the data? Is it if you have any last words to build into that about how would you encourage researchers to go about connecting?
I'm happy to say from Uber Media's perspective first, yes, we're very interested in hearing in different use cases or potentially products. Not every use case should necessarily turn into a product, but many should. And many use cases can be kind of followed by using the query-based tool that we built, which was actually designed to support a wide array of ad hoc use cases. If people are interested in any of the data or tools we offer or would like to discuss mobile location data more, I would encourage you to go to our website, ubermedia.com. There's a form there you can get in touch with us and you can learn a little bit more about what we offer. So that is the best way to continue the dialogue.
Yeah, and from our side, this is good old fashioned product management, right? We love we love to hear feedback on the types of columns or additional attributes that you guys are interested in and how we can best equip those. So the consortium that we were talking about, where we're providing this data, is it's operationalized as a Slack group, which is very fun. We now have more than 4,000 members and academic researchers and government institutions sitting in Slack, all working together. So if you guys have like a feature, throw it out there and we can see how many people give like the thumbs up in Slack, and it'll help us try to think about what additional columns or attributes that might be great. And for my plug on our side is there's like a form link in the doc that I think you guys all have, that if you quickly fill that out, you'll get our non-commercial usage agreement, and then we will give you access to all of SafeGraph's data via CSV. So feel free to dive in if interested.
Yeah, I think on our side, the data that we provide is a bit more processed. So if you go in the GitHub repo that I linked in my slides, you'll find a CSV with the value of the index every day and some other information that we provide to make adjustments. So they're ready to be put into use in regression analysis.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ross and Kate and Victor, and to the participants for these great questions. So as a reminder, we've got the Google Sheet that has some of these frequently asked questions and other resources that have been shared. And I want to thank Shushan, David, and Martin for organizing this, and also want to give a plug for the whole series that Shushan and David and others have organized. And you can see the full schedule at ehealthecon.org. For example, next week, there's a seminar by Ossia Guntella from University of Pittsburgh that will be at the same time at this week, the next week. And you can sign up through the Twitter messages that Shushan and David send out or through the website. So thank you again very much, and looking forward to seeing you in other research venues.
Thank you for having us.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for organizing this.